Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. It's Sunday the 7th of November and this is the Full Scottish. I'm Andrew Wilson and today I'm hosting the programme from our studios in Glasgow. First we will have a short coronavirus update, then I will introduce today's two brilliant guests, and then together we will look at the past week's news from Scotland and from around the world. As at 2 p.m. yesterday, Saturday, there were 3,249 new confirmed cases of COVID-19. There were 24 new, and I'm sorry to say that there were 24 new reported deaths of people who had tested positive. 4,321,350 people have received their first dose of the COVID-19 vaccination, and 3,914,397 have received their second dose. 823 people were in hospital with recently confirmed COVID-19, 55 of whom were in intensive care. Since the start of the pandemic, a total of 659,738 people in Scotland have tested positive for COVID-19, and in Scotland, and 9,291 patients who tested positive have sadly died. Now, we're lucky enough to be joined this afternoon by, as I say, two brilliant guests. Firstly, we have Emma Harper. Emma is the Scottish National Party MSP for the South Scotland region and has been an MSP since the 2016 Scottish Parliament election. She is a degree registered nurse and a member of the Royal College of Nursing, and as a keen Burnsian, Emma is a past president of the Dumfries Ladies Burns Club number 1. Emma, good afternoon. How are you?
I'm very well, Andrew. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today, Emma. We really appreciate it. And we're also joined this afternoon by a regular guest and friend of the programme, Murray Pittock. Murray is a Scottish historian. He is the Bradley Professor of Literature at the University of Glasgow and a Pro-Vice Principal at the university, where he has served in senior roles, including Dean and Vice Principal, since 2008. Outside the university, he serves on the National Trust for Scotland Board and as their Scottish History Advisor. When he was studying at Balliol, he was the Oxford University debating champion, along with one Alexander Boris de Pfeffel Johnson, and he's a past president of the Edinburgh Walter Scott Club. Professor Pittock, Murray, good afternoon. How are you?
Very well, thank you, Andrew. Just grand, in fact, and all the better for it.
Well, I'm delighted to hear that, Murray. And with two such experts on Scottish literature, if nothing else, we'll seek to concentrate today on matters political and the news. But if we drift off into either Burns or Walter Scott, then I'm sure that'll be equally good. But we should move on a little bit. As you would expect, the majority of our discussion today will be associated with the COP26 conference, which is now at the halfway mark, meeting in Glasgow, and we'll look at COP26 and the issues arising from it from a few perspectives this morning, and then we'll have a look at another couple of stories from around the world. But firstly, thinking about what may have been achieved in the first week, in particular with the World Leaders Summit, which was the first couple of days of COP26 at the beginning of this past week, we can see that we have been told that there has been the Declaration on Forest and Land Use, signed by over 100 countries, although bearing in mind that a similar declaration that was signed in New York in 2014 appears to have very little impact. We had the Global Methane Pledge by over 100 countries. We had for the first time, we have heard that India has has made a net zero pledge and has pledged to reach net zero by 2070. We have the Breakthrough Agenda, which is 40 countries have signed up to accelerate the exploration and implementation of clean technology. And we have seen the International Just Transition Partnership, which is intended to assist South Africa transition away from its dependence on coal. And so there have been we're told that there have been some agreements reached so far this week. So Emma, coming to you first, what strikes you from that handful of agreements that apparently have been reached at COP26 so far?
So, as you said, Andrew, we're halfway through the whole conference, and has really been interesting for me, even though I'm not attending Glasgow, to follow the processes of what is being announced and proposes to be what's going to be delivered. So I was really keen to hear about the South Africa agreement, because 90% of the energy created in South Africa is from coal-fired power stations. So that seems to be an ambition that we will absolutely need to keep an eye on. And the 100 countries that have signed up to the deforestation pledge, that's another one that is a big issue, because for us in Scotland, we've planted 80% of the trees that are in the whole of the UK. So they're in Scotland. But in speaking to some farmer colleagues of mine, they're saying trees aren't the only answer, that we need to obviously be looking at other measures as well. So I'm keen to look at, once COP's finished, where do we go from here, as far as like dissecting all the information that's been negotiated and the agreements that are going to be taken forward.
Thanks, Emma. Thank you, Murray. Turning to you now, we've heard of a number of agreements that have apparently been reached, and that certainly gives a sense, or it is maybe intended to give a sense, that progress is being made at COP26. Do you think that when we look at, for example, the very limited impact which the deforestation pledge in 2014 has had, do you think that what prospects do you think that there are for action to be taken and for agreements to be implemented once the COP26 conference has drawn to a conclusion in Glasgow?
Well, I think one of the things we've seen with COP, as we always see with COP, is that there is progress of a sort, but it's never as much as you expect, certainly never as much as Greta Thunberg expects, and that it's a hard job horse trading between countries with very different profiles in terms of energy consumption, and indeed with different profiles as to the economic use of forestry. But the positive thing here is, I think, that Brazil has signed. There's a 2030 date to end deforestation, and that Brazil, who of course is one of the largest deforesting economies and not the largest on the planet, has actually signed up. And in that context also, I think that we often don't see from the news that we receive the extent to which the Scottish Government are committed to afforestation in our own country. So we're moving up the target to 15,000 hectares a year from 2024. And we also they were major sponsors of the Peatlands Pavilion in the Blue Zone in COP26, and picking up Emma's view about different ways of approaching it. Obviously, Scotland has about 10% of the world's peat. There is actually very good, and peat is in many respects a more powerful sequesterer of carbon than forestry, depending on various environmental factors. But it's got a huge impact in terms of its global sequestration. There are relatively few peat areas in the world, and those work, generally speaking, very positive together in international context. So I think in terms of policy making around the development and preservation of peatlands, there is also significant opportunity out of COP. So we've got what we usually get, which we've got progress, and it's never enough. What I would say is that we really do need in the Western democracies to move not to what I fear, which will be a very restrictive and sudden move away, which will alienate the population and alienate the electorate, but to move to the nudge economics that is going to be necessary to not to force people, but to encourage people to move away from ineffective and toxic use of raw materials and purchasing and shopping habits and fuel habits. And again, in a UK government level, we're just not doing that. We're continuing to freeze fuel duty. We're lowering the duty on domestic flights, and we're lowering the subsidy to moving to battery electric vehicles. So, and we're also behindhand in legislating to ensure that there's a single standard for access to electric chargers with the home. It's impossible to access more than a tiny minority of those using bank cards, for example. So there's a lot we could be doing which will encourage people to come along with the decisions made at COP. But we really need to start doing that beyond the agreements. Without the domestic policy of economic nudge to support them, those agreements are really so much more methane, hot air.
Absolutely. Thank you, Murray. And your point about the pace of change and the rate of change and the depth of change that's required is an interesting one, and I think it's one that we will come back to this afternoon. I think we'll definitely also come back to be looking at what might be described as Johnsonian politics as regards both COP26 and the UK. But Emma, Murray mentioned, did well not to mention it in the first 10 minutes, Greta Thunberg, the activist. Now, Greta, of course, Ms. Thunberg is well known for criticising politicians for only producing blah blah blah, in her words. Now, I'm putting this question to you because you're the elected politician who's with us today. Do you think that criticism by Greta Thunberg is justified? We've just been talking about the number of agreements that have already been reached at COP26 so far. And by definition, they have been reached by the process of bringing people together, sitting down in a room or on Zoom, and discussing the issues and reaching agreement. So is it when she appears to criticise those who are meeting at COP26, do you think Ms. Thunberg's criticisms are justified?
Well, I certainly think that she has grabbed the hearts and minds of many, many people, and she has helped probably nudge processes forward and for people to engage. I mean, there's so many young people now that are active in dealing with the climate emergency and supporting whatever we can do to return our natural environment and support biodiversity. So I personally feel as if our politicians in Scotland, the First Minister has demonstrated an absolute ability to engage with people and hear the voices and listen to folk as well. So maybe blah, blah, blah could be assigned to other politicians, but using Murray's nudge theory language, I think what we are seeing is other countries are now getting on board. You've just said India have a commitment to be at net zero by 2070, and folk are even criticising, saying that India, that's too long. 2070 is too long, but it doesn't mean that let's look at the process. Let's encourage the economies of the world outside Europe, outside of the USA. Let's encourage them all to nudge forward and then amend dates so that we can maybe reduce that 2070 to maybe 2060 or even 2050. So I think what we do need to do is make sure that the processes that have been agreed on, we need to measure that. We need to make sure that analysis is made so that we can say, yep, the politicians are taking action, and that way maybe Greta Thunberg will change the blah, blah, blah to yes, yes, we've listened.
Thanks, Emma. Now, Murray, this may seem a little bit of a handbrake turn, but if you'll bear with me for a second, I'll explain my thinking here. We've been talking about international agreements and treaties that have been reached in the course of COP26 so far and at previous COP meetings. You'll also be aware that in Broadcasting Scotland, we seek to continue to watch more than one story at a time, and also that we seek to watch important news breaking from other parts of the world. We don't focus entirely on Scotland. Now, this week we've been reporting repeatedly, and there's more news this morning, that the German politician Christian Schmidt, who is the international high representative in Bosnia, has said that the peace deal there that ended the country's war in the 1990s is at risk of unravelling unless the international community takes measures to stop Serb separatists. He was referring to moves by the Bosnian Serb leadership that are aimed at undoing key state institutions, such as the Joint Armed Forces, the Indirect Taxation Authority, and the top judicial body, as well as other institutions. Christian Schmidt has said, if the degradation of the Dayton Treaty continues, there is a risk that the country will break apart. Now, I'm struck in terms of UK politics by the UK government appearing to have an occasional approach, I'll put it in those terms, to its treaty commitments, not least in the context of Brexit and not least in the context of the Northern Ireland Protocol. So thinking about agreements generally and political promises that are made with regard to agreements, Murray, do you think that that the events in Bosnia are an indication or a bellwether that governments are becoming less bothered or less committed to maintaining the agreements that they've made, or is this just a little bit of local difficulty?
Well, I wouldn't like to say that governments are less likely to implement agreements worldwide, and that's a matter of principle. But there are certain issues which are pulling in that direction in a number of quarters. One of them is the extreme polarization of politics in the US. One of them is the attitude towards treaty negotiation of the UK government. And another one, which is more influential in continental Europe, is populism generally. Now, rather like neoliberalism, populism is a word that is bandied about and breathes endlessly without anyone generally inquiring what it is. But I take populism to be ultimately the provision of simple solutions to complex problems presented in a national framework. And if you start suggesting that there are simple solutions to complex problems, be they the Northern Ireland Protocol and the Good Friday Agreement of 1998, be they the Dayton Accords and the agreement for a split ethno-cultural polity in Bosnia-Herzegovina, that actually those agreements become much more endangered because they are complicated. They were a sophisticated response to difficult circumstances which didn't involve people retreating into lagers of prejudice, simplicity, and national chauvinism, or at least where they did see those in front of them, controlling them with an organization and governance structure which enabled a power sharing agreement to take place. So I think that's the major risk in what you're seeing. Valuable time was lost in the COP related process because of the Trump administration's polarization in the US. We have seen the discussion in Parliament and elsewhere of the UK government's attitude towards its agreements with the European Union, but above all, the simplistic and nationally bounded politics of populist governments in continental Europe and elsewhere in the world have created an opening for unscrupulous and militant groups to put pressure on multilateral agreements of this kind.
Thanks, Murray. That was a very striking analysis of the situation, both globally and as it relates to our friends in Bosnia. And I suspect that we will be returning to the news from Bosnia repeatedly over the next few months. I only hope that peace manages to prevail in that part of the world. What we'll do now is that we'll move on and we'll look at COP26 from a slightly different perspective. Another phrase that is bandied around as much as populism, especially during COP26, has been just transition. Now, the roots of just transition go much more deeply and further back in the succession of COP conferences that there have been. However, it is something that we have heard a great deal about so far this week. It struck me that just transition has a number of aspects to it. There is the aspect of rich nations and having to work with poor nations. I'm aware of one also thinks of developed nations and developing nations. I think in COP speak, developed nations are what are called Annex 1 countries and developing countries are what are referred to as Annex 2 countries. I'm also thinking of the contrast between more industrialized societies and more agricultural societies. And so it struck me that similarly there are those contrasts being such complex problems and such complex challenges, I was wondering, Emma, do you think that with such complexity and by definition there are no simple solutions to such complex challenges, what prospects do you think there are for achieving a just transition as a result of the discussions that have been taking place at COP26 this week?
Yeah, well, I'm pleased that Scotland has the first net zero minister in Richard Lochhead. I think we obviously need to support the countries that are developing. So, as a member of the Scottish Parliament who's in the same team as the Scottish Government, I am happy that the First Minister has announced funding to support countries like Malawi, for instance. But we heard, I think, one of the climate change activists said that only 3% of the world's emissions are from the developing countries or the global south. And, that's quite a stark figure when climate change or the effects of climate change is more severely felt in countries, in the global south. So I think what we need to do is make sure that the countries with the deep pockets, with plenty funds, can support other nations to do whatever they can to mitigate potential upcoming measures that they might take forward to industrialise their cities or their towns. So we need to make sure that support is given to countries that are going to need it, especially those countries that are feeling the effects of climate change, of the climate emergency.
Thank you, Emma. I'll stay with you for a minute. We were talking there about the global prospects for just transition, but I'm struck that part of the challenges related to the climate crisis are the global and the local implications which run together. And I know that the Scottish Government has announced this week that the Climate Action Towns programme will empower communities to come together and engage in collective climate action, taking account of the unique challenges and opportunities each town faces. That could include looking at what action can be taken on to switching, for example, to more sustainable food or more renewable energy. Communities in 7 towns will be offered support to find ways of making changes at a local level that will help tackle the crisis, giving them a voice and engaging those that may not have previously engaged in climate action. The programme will be delivered by Architecture and Design Scotland with funding from the Scottish Government. And I'll get to the point here for you, Emma. The towns are Stevenson, Invergordon, Holytown, Campbelltown, Blackburn, Alness and Annan. Now, as a former resident of the town of Annan, I wanted to ask you, what prospects do you think there are for taking action as a result of COP26 at a very local level, for example, in any of these 7 towns that have been focused on by the Scottish Government this week?
Well, it's great that the Scottish Government have got Annan as one of the towns. It's 16 miles along the road from where I live. And what we focused on yesterday when I was at the COP26 event at the University of Glasgow's Crichton campus, we focused a lot about what can we do locally, nationally and internationally. And I think we need to remember that, when we're talking about the climate footprint, we also have the climate shadow or the carbon shadow that corporations create, big companies as well. So yes, we need to focus on what we can do to help local communities do whatever they can, whether it is tackling food waste, whether it is like for me in the southwest, we've got 48% of Scotland's dairy farms. So I know there's a lot of work being done to look at efficiency and look at how we support management of slurry using anaerobic digesters. So at very local levels, a lot can be done, but we also need to be focusing on the big picture of the climate shadow created by global corporations as well.
Absolutely. Thank you, Emma. And Murray, returning to you, the one strong theme that we've had already this week from COP26 and that is fundamental to the just transition conversation is, I suppose I would characterise it as following the money. Now, we know that one of the targets for COP26 is to seek a replacement agreement for the $100 billion, which the wealthy nations had undertaken to provide to developing nations in order to help fund their move to their transition in a just way. We also know that nothing like that $100 billion has actually been paid, and we know that countries are thinking very carefully about where they position themselves in the context of paying or being paid. We know that at the beginning of COP26, Turkey, for example, asked to be removed from the list of developed nations into the list of developing nations. Murray, in terms of the cash, in terms of cold hard cash, do you think that there is a prospect from COP26 of there being an effective replacement agreement regarding funding a just transition for Annex II for developing countries, or are we just going to hear more fine words, but not payment of the amounts that countries have said that they will make, that they will hand over?
Well, it's a general truth in the announcement of political funding that the headline numbers, when announced, never quite add up behind the scenes when they're picked over. But there are a lot of pressures on a lot of the Western and more advanced economies in the current context, not least with the recovery from COVID. So I would be very surprised to see a meaningful, large-scale public commitment. What I think is actually more hopeful is the extent to which private finance globally has indicated its increasing interest in giving preferential investment to green investments. This has already been happening to some extent. It's been harder and harder to get fossil fuel exploration and debt funding for many of the oil exploration companies, but it looks as if it's going to quicken and develop. So there will be a definite move towards preferential funding for carbon capture, for green technological policies. Now, what we need to actually encourage that private funding is not so much double counting or headline amounts of public money. We need the domestic policies which will reinforce the demand for that funding, and that requires, for example, there already is a fully functioning international market in carbon, but it's not perfectly developed yet. It needs to become more developed. We do need to have a proper carbon market, and we need to have a much greater awareness of the lateral costing of what things are that we do. So, for example, and to take some of the things that might be done in a smaller community in Scotland, if you were to buy Thai frozen prawns, the footprint of a Thai frozen prawn is roughly 7 times that of shellfish from Scottish waters. So the carbon footprints for many of the things we buy every day are enormous. And one of the things we need to do in domestic policy is to make people aware of, in Tim Berners-Lee's word, how bad are bananas. Actually, they're not that bad at all compared to other stuff. But to actually to drive people's choices, and in driving people's choices, make it much more worthwhile for money to go into green projects, because they will be the economic future, but they need the policy framework to sustain them in order for them to be the economic future. I mean, so far, a large part of Tesla's business model has been built on selling environmental credits to polluters. I'm not suggesting that's a long-term model for Tesla. They're transitioning out of it now, but it is a model that we need to look at more closely and carefully. We need to think about the policies that will sustain lower carbon footprint and to increase costs for those that will not, and therefore to support the private sector's investment in green technology worldwide, because green technology will become more profitable and more desirable, certainly in the back of a developed market in carbon.
Thanks, Murray. It certainly struck me thinking this week, that there's something like $1 trillion under management with investment managers in Edinburgh, and that one of the solutions to the challenges that we're facing is to to encourage, or is to facilitate that those funds being invested. Excuse me. And they did invest in Tesla and have continued to do so, but to encourage those funds under management to prioritise green investments and to pull it and to withdraw from carbon-based investments and opportunities. And so I think in Scotland we'll be paying close attention to the way in which that money moves. But thank you for the moment, Murray. What we'll do now. This week on Broadcasting Scotland, we've been lucky enough to have a number of visitors and volunteers who've been out and about during COP26, speaking to participants and politicians. And earlier this week, we were able to grab a few minutes with our own First Minister and have a quick interview with her. And so we'll run a quick VT of that interview, and then we'll carry on talking about issues relating to COP26.
Thank you. Very nice to be with you.
First Minister, so the first week of COP is almost over. And what do you take away from it? Are you satisfied with how it went? And what are your impressions of the leaders or presidential summit that we see in the 1st and 2nd of November?
Well, we're halfway through COP. It's not until this time next week that we will really have a sense of the outcome and whether that has been a success or not. I think inside the COP summit there is an increased sense of optimism at this halfway point that we may see a better outcome than we would have anticipated a week ago, but there's still a long way to go. What we do know is that even if this COP gets a bit further than we expected it to get, there's still going to be a gap between where we are and where the world needs to be to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. So I'm cautiously, tentatively optimistic at this stage, but there's a lot of hard work still to be done.
First Minister, you have shown such great leadership when it comes to taking the world through COP, and you have shown it from every day, from day one to today, the 7th day of COP. Why is it important for Scotland to show the world, hey, this is what we can do, this is how we can do it, and this is the example that you can follow in order to reach all those ambitious goals that are set here at COP?
Well, first and foremost, Scotland is the location for this COP, so practically, logistically, we, in partnership with the UN and the UK government, have a responsibility to make sure it goes smoothly and all of the conditions are right for the political discussions to be successful. But more generally, Scotland is a developed country. Scotland, Glasgow, where COP is happening, led the world into the Industrial Revolution. We have benefited for decades, centuries now from the emissions that are causing climate change. So we've got a massive responsibility now to lead by example in tackling climate change, and in particular to help those countries that are on the front line of the effects of climate change but have done so little to cause it, adapt and mitigate in future. So there's a moral responsibility on the shoulders of countries like Scotland, and it's really important that we live up to that.
Oh, absolutely. Will you, First Minister, then take the leaders who have promised those ambitious goals responsible, will hold them responsible if they don't meet the targets that are set here in Scotland and Glasgow?
We all have to hold ourselves and each other accountable. In Scotland, we have a process of legally binding annual targets that we have to report against, and some years we'll fall short of those, and then we have to set out how we're going to catch up. So there's really rigorous and transparent accountability in Scotland, and we've got to see that across the globe. One of the things I'll be looking for out of this COP is how that accountability is going to be delivered, so that the commitments that are being made are delivered, and the gap that exists between the commitments and what the world needs, we've got transparency about how that's going to be closed in future.
And one last question, First Minister, of course. You met with the activists as well. They have different messages, they have different criteria when it comes to climate change. What do you think, how right are they, and how far can they go with this, and will they make an impact in inclusion of the young people when it comes to climate change, of making the policies before everything?
I think the climate activists are already having an impact, have had a big impact. I don't think we'd be in the position we're in now with some cautious optimism about real progress if it wasn't for the voices of climate activists and young activists in particular. It's not for me to say, they're wrong or they're right. It's for people like me to listen and to use that anger, that frustration, that passion to drive things forward further and faster. And I think one of the responsibilities of those inside the COP summit is how do we bridge that gap between the sense of optimism that is there inside it and the sense of frustration outside it. Now, there always should be a gap because that will drive the process further, but how do we bring people together to say we're not there yet, we are far from there, and this COP is not going to get us everywhere we need to go, but we're moving forward further and faster. So that's a big challenge for the next week of the summit.
First Minister, thank you very much.
Thank you.
There we are, and I should certainly make a point of saying thank you to Ika Ferragotic for that package, and also to our friends at N1 in Bosnia and CNN, with whom we've been collaborating over the past week in producing material, helping to produce material for them for their coverage, their excellent coverage of COP26. Now we'll return to discussions of COP26. We heard the First Minister there talking about the voices of activists and their passion to drive things forwards. We know that the tens of thousands of protesters marched on Saturday through Glasgow and in many other cities around the world, demanding bolder action at the COP26 conference. Kim Travers of Edinburgh said, "It's good to have your voice heard, even with the rain. I think it makes it a wee bit more dramatic." And Philip Schmel, who had travelled from Germany for the march yesterday, said, "The climate crisis is about the survival of humanity as we know it. It's up to the youth and the workers, the working class, to bring about the change that is necessary." And just in terms of protest and the protests that there were in Glasgow on Friday and on Saturday, after the march yesterday, ACC Gary Ritchie, who's been responsible for policing the processions and the marches in Glasgow, said that Glasgow has today hosted a public protest the size and scale of which was beyond anything many of us, both within and out with policing, can ever remember. And I think the numbers this morning are that it's estimated that there were up to 100,000 people on the streets of Glasgow yesterday, and there were, I'll say, only 22 arrests, 21 at King George V Bridge, and one other arrest during the march. And so, Emma, turning to you again as the representative elected politician with us today, do you think the protests that the peaceful protests that we've seen on Friday and Saturday in particular, do you think that they will make a difference?
Definitely. I think what we need to I guess acknowledge is that these protests are peaceful. We need to make sure that we engage with folk. We need to make sure we listen. We need to make sure we can enable and empower local voices and the protesters' voices to be heard. So that's something that I absolutely support. I think if I wasn't here in Dumfries today or this weekend working on my COP26 information yesterday, I would have been in Glasgow myself. So I am keen to make sure that we make sure that people know that they're being listened to, and that the what they're asking for, we need to make sure that action is going to be taken forward, and we measure it as well, so that we can prove that that I suppose governments and countries are listening to the protesters.
Thanks, Emma. And Murray, turning to you, reflecting on the protests that we've seen this week, and also the volume, the nature of the police operation that we've also seen, and which I think everybody I've spoken to this week has commented on. I live in the east of the country, and the scale of the policing operation in cities other than in Glasgow has been, I think, unprecedented as well. But Murray, do you think that the level of policing and that we've seen, both of the conference, but I'm thinking in particular the level of policing of the protests on Friday and especially yesterday, do you think that that's having an effect now of perhaps neutering the impact that the protests have?
I wouldn't myself say so. I think the policing looks to have been, a lot of police were of course sent up from England as well. I'm not sure how many of them have been involved in the policing of the protests, but I think Police Scotland conducted themselves with the typical care and community thoughtfulness that they often do on these occasions. What I would say is I'm a skeptic of protests. I don't think protests make a blind bit of difference on the whole. I don't think they made a difference in the Iraq War. I don't think they made a difference in Brexit. I don't think they make a difference on an independence referendum basis. I am a skeptic. The only way they do make a difference is they've got a strategy attached to them. But I think one thing that's different about these protests is they're protests by people who disagree with a major political program, but who think that that program doesn't go far enough. And so that's where the opportunity for dialogue exists. And I think that that dialogue is much facilitated by having the kind of marches we saw yesterday in Glasgow and all over the world, which were not marches which blocked traffic, not unduly, destroyed people's ability to get to work, destroyed ambulances' abilities to get to hospitals. I've got real concerns that the extreme minorities on the climate side actually alienate popular opinion in a way which makes a move towards a green future less likely. I think by having what's a moderate, recognizable, large-scale march, which is really saying to the politicians of the COP26 and the world, you're not going far enough, but we don't actually oppose you. You're just not going far enough. That's a real opportunity for dialogue. And that I think the politicians have to take. But if the marches are influential, it will be because the politicians understand that they're not oppositional. They're actually about dialogue and about engaging with the concerns overwhelmingly of young voters who in different political decisions over the last 10 years have been repeatedly and occasionally brutally marginalized. So I think the First Minister's political antennae was spot on there. This is a great opportunity for dialogue with people who want to believe that you will make a difference, but have yet to be convinced that you will make enough of one.
Thank you, Murray. That's grand. What we'll do now is we'll move away a little bit from discussing COP26. We'll move to UK politics for a moment, and then we'll return to COP26 before the end of the programme. Inevitably, well, as we know, we had a number of world leaders were present in Glasgow at the beginning of the week, and that included the host Prime Minister, the UK Prime Minister, Boris Johnson. We know that he is very much a late convert to the cause of climate activism. In December 2015, just after the COP24 in Paris, he used his column in the Daily Telegraph to question whether the mild winter weather that year was attributable to climate change, and said that fear of climate change, as far as he understood the science, is equally without foundation. However, it does appear that Johnson has gone through something of a Damascene conversion, I'm sure he would call it, and so he now has aligned himself with those who are expressing alarm at the climate crisis. However, in expressing that alarm, he's been giving it the full Johnsonian treatment. When addressing the UN, he said, "When Kermit the Frog sang, it's not easy being green, I want you to know he was wrong, and he was also unnecessarily rude to Miss Piggy." And that was in September. And then, of course, opening the Glasgow talks, he did a bit about James Bond and a ticking time bomb. Johnson, Murray, I'll put this to you. Johnson is, more than anything, a facile student in a perpetual essay crisis, staying up late, scribbling unwieldy, fancy-sounding analogies to get through yet another late assignment. Something Sophocles, but it's mostly wordplay and bullshit. Murray, do you think that we have a Prime Minister who has the energy or the commitment or the concentration to deliver anything from COP26?
Well, it isn't just down to the Prime Minister to deliver something from COP26. I think that Boris Johnson is not as quite as described in that summary of his character. I think that he's very responsive to currents round about him, and that he is expert at riding those currents. I suspect that's one of the reasons that he's moved towards a more green agenda. Does his record suggest that he will make good on extensive green promises? Not altogether so far, I think, is the answer. I suggested a while ago that actually UK domestic policy was really going in the other direction, if anything. And I think we really need to focus on that area, as I've said more than once in the course of this discussion, and domestic policy, but it's not just the UK's government responsibility to focus on domestic policy. If we have a situation where rail fares increase by the retail price index, which the government officially no longer believes in, but the domestic airfares fall, we obviously don't have a green agenda, do we?
Absolutely, Murray. Thank you. And to continue discussing Johnson and UK politics, of course, this week we've heard that Boris Johnson's former chief advisor claimed that the controversial amendment to block Owen Paterson MP's suspension was actually about covering up the Prime Minister's illegal donations. It comes as the government announces a humiliating U-turn over the vote, with Jacob Rees-Mogg telling MPs just 19 hours after the vote to overhaul the common standards system that the proposed changes would be put on hold until ministers can secure cross-party support. Dominic Cummings, who quit Downing Street last November and has since become a leading critic of his former boss, has said that the Prime Minister had a number of ulterior motives in proposing the overhaul of the Commons disciplinary process. Writing in a series of tweets, Cummings claimed the amendment was really about the Prime Minister and his own lies regarding illegal donations, not Owen Paterson. He alleged Mr Johnson is worried that an investigation led by Independent Standards Commissioner Catherine Stone into the way donations were used to fund the Downing Street flat will show that Boris Johnson broke the rules. The former advisor also claimed the Prime Minister was keen to oust Miss Stone just hours after Business Minister Kwasi Kwarteng came under fire for calling for her resignation. Mr Cummings wrote on Twitter, "Part of the point of yesterday is the removal of Kay Stone." So, Emma, we know that the practices that Owen Paterson was found by the Standards Committee to have been guilty of would be criminal offences in Scotland. They're not in England, but they are in Scotland. What do you think is happening at Westminster at the moment, and what do you think will happen next?
Yep, it's only, Andrew, it's every time I suppose we hear the next story or the next story, it's like peeling an onion of Tory corruption and cronyism, from prorogue in Parliament to even handling the pandemic, jobs for your pals, contracts for your pals. The whole thing is just, everybody, I don't really like to use the word sleaze, but the whole thing is just, it's constant. So maybe Dominic Cummings has a point when he says that Boris is doing it to protect himself. But I'm sure there's more than Owen Paterson or Boris that we need to be concerned about, because they're trying to rewrite the rule book for how we I suppose assess our MPs and make sure that people are following the rules. So Owen Paterson has now resigned from his job. He was facing a 30-day suspension, and then he would have been back. But now the whole thing is just blown up, which allows the further, I suppose, investigation of every other contract or process or cronyism issue that keeps coming up. And it's something that his government, even handling the pandemic, is just it's just every time we turn the stone over, there's another story. So I don't think we're done yet seeing what's happening in number 10.
Thanks, Emma. And Murray, following on a little bit from what you were saying a moment ago, I'll refine what I said before. It's mostly wordplay and bullshit and cash and power. Do you think that the events of the past week, do they demonstrate that there are challenges or problems beginning to beset Mr. Johnson, and that we're seeing his reaction, which is to try and in circumstances where there is a threat, he rather than deal with the issue at hand, he seeks to neutralise or neuter it by changing the rules.
Well, I think actually what we may, if there is a legacy from this week, and what it may come to be seen as the mistake was actually U-turning on the issue once you'd forced it through. Because I have to say, I do think these issues are generally storms in a teacup. We all get, and I don't mean that they're not serious, but that we get exercised about them on programs like this, but if you look even at the polling in the last 2 or 3 days, there's hardly any sign of a dent in the Conservative Party's position, and I don't expect it to have any long-term effect at all. The truth of the matter is that, and this reflects how we report and understand politics, is that £110,000 for representing two private companies on a preferential basis to government ministers and departments is not really regarded as very much of a story compared to claiming a couple of false taxi fares or subletting your constituency office and forgetting about it, or exceeding election expenses by a few quid. Ultimately, the stories that often bring politicians right down are the trivial stories. This is not a trivial story, but in terms of long-term politics and its effect on the Conservative support, it is trivial. And if there is a long-term effect, it will be because the Prime Minister forced through a whip to get people to support a change and then pushed back when a big pushback came. And I have to say that probably the former Cabinet Minister, Mr. Patterson, did not help himself by going on television basically saying, what is this? There's nothing to see here. Afterwards, a little bit of contrition would probably have been able to get him through the system, but he wasn't really prepared to do that. So I think that long term, this is not likely to have an effect, except insofar as it shows the Prime Minister's lack of consistency in judgment, and that is its only long-term effect.
Thanks, Murray. Wise words, I think, in the context of politicians and the Prime Minister in particular. For our final item this afternoon, we will return to COP26, and it has struck me, and I think it's been widely reported that in a way Scotland has been on the world stage this week. Glasgow certainly has, and at the same time, we on this programme today, we've spoken about local aspects and global aspects of the climate crisis and the challenges that we all face. Now, I know that devolved governments, regions and cities from across the globe will today send a strong message to world leaders by committing to achieve net zero by 2050. Our First Minister will tell the General Assembly of the Under 2 coalition that by signing up to the pledge in a new Memorandum of Understanding, they will be signalling the level of ambition required of COP26 to keep global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Promising Scotland's continued support for the coalition, which has 260 members representing 50% of the global economy, the First Minister said, "Everyone knows what is required for this summit to be a success. COP26 must secure the commitments that will limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, or at the very least, the near-term commitments that will keep that objective alive." As Scotland is determined to play its part in ensuring the long-term strength of this coalition, because we recognise its enormous value and its potential to achieve even more. So, Murray, I'll stay with you for a moment, if I may. In the context of the nation of Scotland and its position in the context of COP26, do you think Scotland has shown an ability to make a difference to COP26, and do you think that if we were a fully signed up member of the United Nations as an independent country, do you think Scotland would be able to have a bigger impact?
I think there's no question that one of the reasons that states don't want to voluntarily surrender their independence is because they reckon they can have a bigger impact by being independent states. And it is indeed very peculiar to want to give your independence away for any reason once you are an independent state, and states don't tend to want to do that. In some ways, then, absolutely, that's always going to be a non-issue. States are more influence than non-states. I think the First Minister and other members of the Scottish Government have done a really good job in being ambassadorial in a major COP26, a major global climate change conference event happening in Glasgow, to which initially the idea was to exclude the Scottish Government from altogether. I think one of the things, the opportunities we have going forward, and we will have to focus. I mean, the whole, Global Climate Justice Fund from the Scottish Government is only £6 million. We don't have great resources. We have to focus on what we can do, but there's some really important areas we can focus on. One of them is that Scotland, through the expanding hubs network, has got a global footprint, a small but nevertheless definite global footprint already, and that Scotland, the brand, understood internationally, is often linked towards rather nostalgic visions of Scotland rather than modern scientific cutting edge ones. So I think the extent to which our hubs can be the platforms for a program which prioritizes cutting edge Scottish research in the climate and sustainability areas coming out of our universities, cutting edge Scottish businesses. For example, I was pleased, having been involved in the Scottish government's preparations for the Dubai Expo, the launch of the space strategy and the importance of Arctic satellite coverage to monitor climate change. That's a story that needs to be more widely understood. And thanks to the Expo coverage has already begun that journey. And also we need to use the hubs to champion the importance of what people already value about the Scottish brand, which is its tradition, its organic qualities, its, if I may, return to Scott and Burns, land of the mountain and the flood, its tradition of organicism and agriculture, because changed attitudes towards long-distance global supply chains for food, the importance of local produce and provenance, they will benefit our tourism, they will benefit our carbon footprint. We can do excellent work in this area, and there's a lot of potential still there, combined with the range of sustainability research in our universities and the extent of our climate or climate-related business and SME development in the country. We have three themes which could be platformed across the world via the external affairs and culture and the Scottish hubs, the leads in the various areas from Washington, D.C. to Brussels.
Thank you, Murray. And Emma, picking up on one of those themes finally with you, Murray was talking about the strength of the Scottish agricultural sector and the importance of agriculture and food production to the Scottish economy, and the way in which our elements of that travel very quickly and very impactfully around the world. Now, I remember that you grew up on a farm yourself. And as you were saying, 45% of the dairy herd for Scotland is in your region. Do you think that we're doing enough in Scotland at a local or at a government level to use Scotland's strengths in the agricultural sector and food production to transmit or to share messages with regard to climate change and what needs to be done in order to address the current climate crisis?
Yeah, I think there is a lot of work that's been undertaken right now. Yesterday, one of the lectures that I attended at the COP26 Dumfries University of Glasgow campus project, it was a presentation about farming for a better climate. And it was followed immediately by one of the National Farmers Union chairs of our local area, who is a dairy farmer himself. And so they recognise that something needs to be done, and what we need to do as a government or as politicians is support the farmers and enable them to measure what their emissions are and then take action to mitigate it, because there's lots of fantastic research that's been done, and the climate and environment scientists that presented yesterday as well were like at Dumfries. We're not a big town, but what they're doing is using their evidence in order to present what we can do to make changes. Maybe down the line, instead of us saying Lang may your lum reek, we need to be saying Lang may Scotland lead, because I seriously think that we are doing a good job, whether it is with agriculture, whether it's with challenging the transport issues, which is a biggest emissions reduction or biggest emitter. So we need to be doing whatever we can, and I think this is a way for Scotland to actually demonstrate how Scotland is one of the leaders in tackling the climate emergency, and puts us on the world stage to show that that the First Minister and her government are serious about doing whatever we can to mitigate and make sure that we have 1.5 degrees as our target, for our climate change ambitions.
Thanks, Emma. That's tremendous. And that is the final item on the Full Scottish Today. In making these programmes, Broadcasting Scotland relies on the support of viewers and others who value our distinctive approach to news, culture and current affairs. If you would like to support us, and we would really like you to support us, then please consider subscribing or donating, and you will find the link to do that on the screen now. There are other ways in which you can also support our work at Broadcasting Scotland. If you would like to volunteer to work either in front of the cameras or behind the scenes, then please visit our website at www.broadcastingscotland.scot and send us a message there. Meantime, we will be here again tomorrow at 7 o'clock in the evening with Scotland at 7, so please join us then. I'd like to say very many thanks indeed to Emma Harper, MSP, and to Professor Murray Pittock for their time and their contributions today. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Murray. And of course, thanks to everyone for joining us and watching Broadcasting Scotland today. I hope that you've enjoyed a tasty Full Scottish Today, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of your weekend.